The words that changed everything weren't spoken into a microphone at Carnegie Hall or the Copacabana. They were whispered into a cheap sound system at a third-rate nightclub on Sunset Strip, where the ashtrays overflowed and the dreams were smaller. But on March 15, 1952, in a room that smelled of stale cigarettes and broken promises, Dean Martin spoke one sentence that would echo through Hollywood for decades. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. And truth, in a town built on lies, cuts deeper than any scream. The Val Monte Lodge squatted on Sunset Strip like a forgotten secret, its neon sign flickering intermittently. The building was a 1920s relic, wearing its age like a cheap suit, rumpled, stained, but still trying to maintain dignity. Inside, red velvet curtains hung heavy with decades of cigarette smoke. The stage was barely large enough for a piano and a man with a microphone, raised 18 inches above the main floor. The lighting was harsh, unforgiving, 3 spotlights with mismatched bulbs that showed every line on a performer's face, every bead of sweat, every moment of doubt. This wasn't the glamorous Hollywood tourists came to see. This was where dreams came to die slowly, one failed audition at a time, where ambitious young people came to reinvent themselves, only to discover that reinvention required more than talent and hope. Dean Martin stood in the cramped dressing room, adjusting his tie in a cracked mirror. The reflection looking back at him was hungry, not for food, though he'd eaten little that day, but for something bigger than this room with its peeling wallpaper and single bare bulb. At 25, Dean had been grinding for years through small clubs, weddings, bar mitzvahs, anywhere that would pay $50 in a meal. His real name was still Dino Crosetti, but that name belonged to a barber's son from Steubenville, Ohio, who'd spoken broken English until age 8. Dean Martin was the invention, the hope, the possibility of escape. But late at night, in rooms like this, the mask felt heavy, the careful pronunciation slipped back toward childhood cadences, because no matter how well he dressed, how smoothly he sang, there were still men who looked at him and saw only what they expected, another ethnic trying to climb above his station. The year 1952 was brutal for anyone trying to make it in entertainment, particularly if your last name ended in a vowel and your skin held the olive tones of Southern Europe. The war was over, but the economy was tight, and club owners were cautious with their money. Veterans were coming home, looking for work, and there was a sentiment in the air that jobs should go to real Americans first. Audiences were fickle, suspicious of anything that felt foreign or different. The Val Monte Lodge was owned by Morris Goldstein, a heavyset promoter who'd given Dean a 2-week run. Morris paid $50 a night plus drinks and treated performers with rare respect. More importantly, talent scouts occasionally drifted through the lodge, men from bigger clubs, record labels, movie studios, who watched with the cold calculation of accountants evaluating assets. This could be Dean's break. Morris had mentioned tonight might be special, that important people might attend. Dean had learned to read the signs, the way Morris polished the bar himself, personally arranged flowers, checked the sound system twice. By 11:30 p.m., Dean had performed 2 sets. The first was rough, advertising executives talking through Blue Moon, a woman ordering drinks during I'll Never Smile Again. But the second set was better. The room had quieted during That's Amore, and real applause followed, not just polite clapping. He was scheduled for a final midnight set, the prime slot when drinks had loosened wallets and inhibitions. Dean stepped onto the stage, feeling the worn floorboards give under his weight. He adjusted the loose microphone stand and nodded to Charlie, the tired piano player, whose fingers moved with mechanical precision. The opening notes of I'll Never Smile Again began drifting through the smoky air. That's when he noticed the table near the front. 3 men in expensive suits, their voices cutting through the music like broken glass. The center figure was loudest, Harold Epstein, whose photograph appeared regularly in society pages. Epstein was old money, East Coast aristocracy transplanted to California, the kind of wealth that came with 3 generations of entitlement. The banker was 48, with thinning hair and soft manicured hands. His custom suit cost more than Dean made in 6 months. He owned half of downtown Los Angeles, office buildings, hotels, restaurants. But power, Dean had learned, didn't make men better. Sometimes it just gave them sophisticated ways to be cruel. Epstein had been drinking since 9 o'clock, his face flushed, his eyes holding the mean glitter of a man who enjoyed causing pain. He'd been making comments throughout Dean's set, nothing loud enough for the whole room, but sharp enough to cut. Comments about ethnic types, about immigrants, about greasers trying to be crooners. Dean kept singing, but his jaw tightened with each whispered insult. This wasn't random drunken rudeness. This was calculated cruelty from a man who believed money gave him the right to humiliate anyone he chose. Halfway through the song, Epstein stood up. His movement was unsteady, but his voice carried clearly through the room, cutting through the melody like a blade through silk. "Hey, paisan," he called out, using the Italian term with deliberate mockery, his pronunciation exaggerated and theatrical. "You know any songs that aren't depressing? Maybe something from the old country? Something your grandmother hummed while she made spaghetti?" The room went quiet. Dean's voice faltered for just a moment before he continued singing, but the damage was done. The intimate atmosphere he'd been building, the delicate connection with his audience, shattered like glass. Conversations stopped. Waitresses froze in place. Even the bartender, who'd been polishing glasses with mechanical efficiency, looked up from his work. But Epstein wasn't finished. He took a step closer to the stage, swaying slightly, his expensive shoes clicking against the worn wooden floor. "What's the matter, Dino?" His voice was getting louder, more theatrical. He was enjoying the attention, the power, the way every eye in the room was now focused on him. "Did I hurt your feelings? You sensitive like all your people? Quick to anger, quick to cry?" Dean stopped singing. The piano continued for a few more notes before Charlie realized what was happening and let the music die. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, heavy with the weight of unspoken tension. Every eye in the room was on Dean, waiting to see how he would handle this moment. Some faces showed sympathy, working-class patrons who understood what it felt like to be humiliated by someone with money and power. Others showed discomfort, middle-class professionals who wanted the unpleasantness to stop so they could return to their drinks and conversations. A few showed the cruel fascination of people watching a car crash, eager to see blood. Morris Goldstein had appeared at the edge of the room, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. Dean could see the calculation in the club owner's eyes, the financial mathematics of a confrontation. Epstein was a regular customer, someone who spent serious money, who brought other wealthy patrons to the club. Dean was just another struggling singer, replaceable, expendable. If Morris had to choose sides, there was no question which side his business interests demanded. But then Epstein played his trump card. He took another step closer, close enough that Dean could smell the scotch on his breath, could see the cruel satisfaction in his bloodshot eyes. "You know what your problem is, boy?" The banker's voice was getting louder, more theatrical. He was performing now, putting on a show for the room, establishing his dominance in the most public way possible. "Your problem is you think you're better than you are. You think you're some kind of artist, but you're just another dago with a decent voice, trying to climb out of the gutter." Epstein paused, savoring the moment, letting the slur hang in the air. Several people in the audience winced. A woman at a nearby table covered her mouth with her hand, but Epstein wasn't done. "And no matter how much you practice, no matter how nice you dress, no matter how carefully you pronounce your words, you'll always be what you are, garbage, ethnic garbage, pretending to be something it's not." The word hung in the air like a physical blow. Dean felt something cold settle in his stomach, a familiar rage that he'd learned to control over the years. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every Italian kid who'd ever been called a name, every immigrant's son who'd been told he didn't belong, every person who'd been reduced to a stereotype by someone like Harold Epstein. Dean looked out at the audience. Some faces showed sympathy, others showed discomfort. A few showed the cruel fascination of people watching a car crash. But what Dean saw most clearly was resignation, the acceptance that this was just how things were, that men like Epstein could say anything they wanted, and men like Dean had to take it, that money and social position gave some people the right to humiliate others, and the rest of the world was expected to look away. But Dean Martin wasn't just another Italian kid from Ohio anymore. He was something new, something he'd created through will and work and refusal to accept limitations. And in that moment, with Harold Epstein swaying drunkenly in front of the stage, with 80 people watching to see if he would fold or fight, Dean made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He stepped closer to the microphone, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he reached for the stand, his hands were steady. His voice, when it came, was perfectly calm. Not angry, not defensive, just clear and steady and absolutely certain. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was any trace of the struggling singer who'd been pleading for approval just moments before. In his place stood someone else entirely. "You know what, Harold?" Dean said, and the use of the banker's first name cut through the formality like a knife through silk. The familiarity was shocking, calculated, a deliberate stripping away of the social distance that Epstein had been using as a weapon. I may be garbage to you, but at least I'm not drunk garbage making a fool of myself in a third-rate club because my wife won't let me come home. The room went dead silent. The air itself seemed to freeze. Harold Epstein's face went from flushed to pale in an instant, the blood draining away as if someone had opened a valve. Because everyone in Los Angeles, everyone who read newspapers, everyone who attended charity galas, everyone who moved in high society knew that Harold Epstein's marriage was a disaster. His wife, the former Margaret Vanderbilt, had publicly humiliated him at the Museum of Art's annual fundraiser just 2 months earlier, walking out in the middle of his speech when she discovered his affair with his secretary. She'd filed for legal separation and was making no secret of her intention to take half of his fortune in the divorce. But Dean wasn't finished. He leaned into the microphone, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. And Harold, when you wake up tomorrow, you'll still be a miserable old man with more money than friends. But I'll still be young, I'll still be talented, and I'll still be climbing while you're falling. A woman at a corner table gasped audibly. One of Epstein's companions reached out to touch the banker's arm, but Epstein shook him off violently, his eyes never leaving Dean's face. The humiliation was complete, total, surgical in its precision. But Dean had one more cut to make, deeper than the others. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting the room absorb the full impact of what he'd said. Then he delivered the line that would become legend, the words that would be repeated in clubs and restaurants and boardrooms throughout Los Angeles for years to come. The difference between you and me, Harold, is that I chose to be here. You have nowhere else to go. Harold Epstein stood frozen for a moment, his mouth working soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water. The humiliation was complete, devastating, public. In front of a room full of people, witnesses who would carry this story throughout the city, he'd been exposed not just as a bigot, but as a pathetic man whose cruelty came from his own emptiness, whose attacks on others were really attacks on his own failures. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. 10, 15. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then, without another word, Epstein turned and stumbled toward the exit, his expensive shoes sliding slightly on the polished floor. His companions hurried after him, their faces flushed with embarrassment, their eyes focused on the floor. The banker's retreat was complete, undignified, witnessed by everyone in the room. For another moment, the silence held. Then, slowly, like a dam beginning to crack, the room erupted, not in polite applause, but in something deeper, more primal, a recognition that they'd witnessed something rare and precious, a moment when someone had stood up to power without raising their voice, without losing their dignity, without becoming the monster they were fighting. The applause started with the working-class patrons, waitresses, busboys, cab drivers who'd stopped in for a drink after their shifts, men who'd been called names themselves, who'd been dismissed by their betters, who understood exactly what Dean had accomplished. Then it spread to the middle tables, the office workers and shop clerks, who knew what it felt like to be talked down to by bosses who thought money made them superior. Finally, even some of the wealthy patrons joined in, perhaps recognizing something in Dean's response that reminded them of their own moments of powerlessness, their own encounters with men like Epstein, who believed cruelty was their birthright. Charlie, the piano player, was grinning widely, his weathered face creased with joy he hadn't felt in years. This was why he'd gotten into music in the first place, not for money or fame, but for moments like this, when someone used their voice to fight back against injustice. Morris Goldstein looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd witnessed in his own club. The waitresses were exchanging glances, whispering excitedly among themselves. This was the kind of story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. Dean adjusted the microphone. "Now," he said with that trademark grin, "where were we?" Charlie struck up the melody again, and Dean continued his set, as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. Word spread through Hollywood like wildfire, not through newspapers controlled by men like Epstein, but through the underground network of musicians, actors, and writers who understood that something significant had happened. It traveled through late-night diners where performers gathered after shows, through barbershops where stylists whispered to their clients, through mailrooms and backstage areas where the real work of Hollywood got done. Dean hadn't just defended himself, he'd shown it was possible to fight back without becoming the monster you were fighting. He'd proven that dignity couldn't be bought or intimidated, only chosen or abandoned. With each retelling, the story grew in meaning, not in facts, which remained consistent, but in what it represented to people who'd been dismissed, humiliated, or reduced to stereotypes. Within 6 months, Dean was headlining at the Copacabana, the same venue where he'd once been rejected at audition. The bookers who'd dismissed him as just another ethnic crooner were suddenly eager to sign him. Within a year, he'd met Jerry Lewis. Within 5 years, he was one of America's biggest stars, commanding fees that Harold Epstein could only dream of. But those who knew the real story understood it all started that night at the Val Monte Lodge. Harold Epstein's empire remained intact, but his social standing crumbled. The humiliation became the kind of tale that circulated through Hollywood's back channels. He lived another 15 years, growing increasingly isolated and bitter, dying alone in 1967. At his funeral, there were more reporters than mourners. Years later, when asked about that night, Dean would shrug and say, "A man's got to draw a line somewhere. That night, I drew mine." But those who understood the context knew Dean's response represented something larger, proof that dignity couldn't be bought or sold, only chosen. The lesson wasn't about revenge, but about the moment when a person decides who they're going to be, regardless of what others expect. Dean Martin walked onto that stage as Dino Crocetti from Steubenville. He walked off as Dean Martin, a man who would never bow to anyone again. The Val Monte Lodge closed in 1961, torn down for a shopping center. But the story lived on, passed down through generations of performers who understood its meaning, that heroes don't always carry weapons. Sometimes they carry microphones, fighting battles with words instead of fists, with dignity instead of rage, with truth instead of lies.